The 14 most teachings of Jesus, go do these things. Okay? Now, they were very capable of doing that. Right? We have other records of teachings that are exactly that. Okay? If you think about something like how the book of Proverbs or some of those ancient, wisdom teachings are, they lots of ancient genres that would have been just lists of propositions and teachings. And the epistles, and the second is they gave us the Gospels. Okay. Now I want to look at a couple of places in the epistles where we get glimpses of Jesus, because I think it's just kind of important to note that a little bit. If we think about the earliest story that we have about Jesus, and when I say earliest, I mean and we don't necessarily have a really full understanding of that. Okay? We have clues. We have very, very spare clues about when things were written, because the gospel is in the habit of dating the things that they wrote. So the New Testament writers aren't necessarily careful about that. So we can try to construct, and it is tedious work, I'm telling you, academically, to try to construct when different things were written. There are a couple of things that we can use to do that. One is we can use the timeline of historical events that we have from secular sources. Okay? A little bit earlier. Okay? And a similar thing may or may not be happening in the Gospels, just depending on how we read them. All that to say that the Gospels come, we know, some 30, 40, maybe as far as 60 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. Okay? They're in this span of things. And there are a lot of complicated things that we might use to date them in those places. We know that the epistles of '64. Okay? We think that's the span of the stories about Jesus to shape the way that they live. It comes in the story of the Lord's Supper here, right? Where in verse 23 of 1 Corinthians 11, Paul begins by saying this. This is just now, most of the time, we think of this as the good stuff before, or as the prologue before it gets into the good stuff.
he refocuses them on Christ to help them get away from the things that are dividing.
Yeah.
I think.
Okay. You were really sure until that last part, yeah.
Well, that's the way I did it in my class.
Fair way of saying it. I mean, I'm trying to say it as simply as I could, and I still took 3 sentences, so. Okay.
I think we agree. I think we said close to the same thing.
I think so. I tried. Notice that, whatever we might say the point is, the reason we can't say this is the point of it is because he doesn't say that. Okay? What he does instead is he tells a story. Okay? And he tells a story that goes like this. I received from the Lord what I had handed on to you, that the Lord Jesus on the night when he was betrayed took a loaf of bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body for you. Do this for me." All right, so this is an account of something that Jesus did and said, and the context in which he did and said those things. Fair? And they are supposed to, as we have tried to do just moments ago, they are supposed to take that and distill from it instruction about what they are supposed to do in their Lord's Supper gatherings. We all on the same page? Okay, all right. I think it's important. The reason we're doing this little exercise, okay, I'm trying to pull this apart, okay, is because I want us to think about the Gospels as an extended version of this. Does that make sense? Okay. So what we've done, in other words, the Gospels are different than what we've done in the last few weeks in this class. All right? What we've done in the last few weeks of the class have been saying, Jesus says to do this. This is what it means for him to do, for us to do this. Okay? But what the Gospels actually give us is they give us context in which Jesus did and said certain things. And then they leave it up to us to figure out what those things mean. Okay? Does that make some sense? So, when I talk about the danger of the exercise that we've gone through, which has been to take all of that body of material in the Gospels and to distill it into a dozen different specific teachings, the danger of doing that is that we separate it out from the context and the doing. We say these are the things that Jesus said. Okay? Well, that's not exactly how the Gospels gave it to us. They gave it to us in Jesus said these things in this context while he was doing a set of things. And this is the big point. Okay? You can't understand what Jesus says without having an appreciation for what he does. Okay? Everybody soak that in. I want to slow down real heavy there. You can't appreciate what Jesus says without a real appreciation for what he does in the context in which he says those things. Okay? All right.
Use a verb other than appreciate. Understand?
Be shaped by.
Okay.
Okay? Or let's say it this way. It's not just the words that we need in order to be shaped and to be his disciples. We need the whole of it. Okay? And we know that because of, not just because of the shape of the Gospels, but because of what Jesus himself was. Okay? Because of the mystery of the incarnation, right? I mean, isn't that kind of the prologue of the story of John? All right, so John 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, and all things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world did not come through. The world came into being through him, and yet the world did not know. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood, or of the will, or the flesh, or the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh, and it lived among us. Seen his glory, the glory of the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. Okay, so here's the deal, right? The Word is, right? But Jesus comes and the Word is in flesh. It becomes flesh. Okay? And in that, we get to see not just what the Word sounds like or what the Word says or some kind of like finely distilled truth that the Word utters. Jesus was more than his words. Okay? The Gospels are more than his words. They're not just collections of his words. They're also words of his being and his living. Okay? That's what I'm trying to drill down onto, right? And just as so Paul or John goes on to say, right, from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ, right? Okay, what's the rule of it in the Exodus story? Like Moses literally receives like a set of words, okay, and gives those words to the people. Okay? And in Jesus, there's something different happening. The story around who he was and what he did. Okay? And I just wanted to say here, as we work to kind of wrap up what we've been doing for this whole thing, that's important. It's important for us to it's important for us to hear the words of Jesus and to obey the words of Jesus and follow the words of Jesus, okay? But our doing that ultimately is to also appreciate who he was and what he did and the way he lived. Okay? All right, we all kind of on the same page of that a little bit. Okay. That being said, look with me in. Let's see. Got off my page. I want to go into the book of. There it was. I was like, none of this is left. Here we go. Go to the book of Matthew. All right, and let's do one last little exercise in the Gospels. And I want to show you one particular series starting in Matthew chapter 10. I want to show you one particular series. If we have time to do it, if we do it in Matthew quickly enough, we're going to do it in one of the other Gospels, and maybe two Gospels as well. Okay, show you a little bit about how the Gospels carry out the fusion of what Jesus does and what Jesus says. Okay, and we're going to be in Matthew chapter 10, and we're going to look into verse 20. How about verse 16 and following? Man, I don't know. I want to read this whole chapter. All right. Tell you what. Let's skip down to verse 26. 24. I'm going to talk with the elders next week, and we're going to extend class time to 3 hours long and just put it into all this kind of like pick and choosing that we have to do every week, okay? Verse 24, a disciple is not above the master, nor a slave above the master. It is enough for the disciple to be like the teacher and the slave like the master. If they've called the master of the house of Beelzebul, how much more will they malign those of his household? Okay, Jesus in the middle of sending his disciples out, going to send them out, and he's very much preparing them to encounter hardship while they're being sent out. And he does that, he frames that as, hey, other people reject my teaching, and you need to expect that when you go out and you imitate me, that you're going to meet some of the same difficulties that I do. Okay? And then we get, so have no fear of them, for nothing is covered up that will not be uncovered, nothing secret will not become known. What I say to you in the dark, tell in the light. What you hear whispered, proclaim from the housetops. Do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Not two sparrows sold for a penny, yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father. Even the hairs of your head are all counted. So do not be afraid. You are of more value than many sparrows. I love that line. Everyone, therefore, who acknowledges me before others, I will also acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But whoever denies me before others, I also will deny my Father in heaven. Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have come not to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, his daughter against his mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and one's foes will be members of one's old household. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Okay, so at this point, Jesus is using all of this to point out how they have to be prepared to endure conflict because they're his followers. Okay? You're going to go out and people are going to reject you. That does not mean that you are not important to God. God still holds you as more valuable than the birds that are flying around. Okay? But you also need to expect that even those people that are close to you might turn away from you because of your insistence on the gospel. Okay? All right. And that leads to this saying. Whoever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake. Okay. So this is the earliest mention of the cross from Jesus to his disciples. It cannot be understood except as a way of him reaching forward into what's going to happen to him and giving that back to them. Okay? So we started off in the section that we read here about how they should expect to receive negative reactions because he receives negative reactions and they are not any better than he is, right? Okay, so they should expect the same kind of response. We come to this part of it. Okay, it's not quite the end of the whole thing, okay? But we come to this part, and it's, again, Jesus helping them understand the impending hardship that they may endure. And he again does it as being tied to his own walk, his own journey that's coming. All right. Now, I have big questions about what they understood of that. You know, it may just have been that by this time in, you know, this particular lesson from Jesus that their eyes were glazed over and they had no, or maybe they're just not understanding what he's saying at this point. That, you know. But I'll tell you this, in the ancient world, pre-Jesus, for him to speak about taking up a cross voluntarily and following him was about as close to nonsense as anything that we have. Okay? That only stops being nonsense after the resurrection. Okay? Here we have it as an early indication that the disciples aren't just meant to listen to Jesus, they're meant to imitate him. Specifically, imitating him on the way of the cross. Okay? All right. If we go just a little bit later, Matthew sharpens this for us in chapter 16.
Stephen,
Yes.
when you say on the way of the cross,
Yeah.
do you mean, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, I'm trying to get clarification. Do you mean in how he lived on the way to the cross?
Yes. Including submitting to the cross. Okay? And I would say, Rachel, that those, tell me a little bit about what you're asking, because I think I understand, but I want to clarify.
That's just a phrase that I've heard a lot in my life, and it's become one of those church phrases.
Okay.
And when you said it just now, I thought this might be a good chance to have somebody.
Let's unpack it a little bit.
Unpack it so that it's not just a phrase. It actually means something.
So we could narrow what that means to say the way of the cross was everything that happened, say, from Gethsemane to Golgotha, right? Okay, where Jesus literally submits to the suffering of the cross. Okay, I would say in the broadest terms, when I think about the way of the cross, I would say I'm talking about Jesus' willingness to sacrifice for the sake of others. Okay? Now here's the catch though. I don't want to separate that out. This is exactly what we're working on right now. I don't want to separate that out from the rest of what comes in the Gospels. In fact, I think the reason Matthew is telling us that earlier is to signal, even then, Jesus is already following the way of the cross. Okay? When Jesus stands up to false religious teachers, okay, when Jesus I just like we would say that the Gospels don't give us a separated book that's just the teachings of Jesus, we should also note, we really should also note, that they don't give us a separate book that is just what we call the Passion of Jesus either. That's really important. Okay? Because what we have, the story of the cross, is all. This is really remarkable, guys. It did not have to be this way. Okay, we could very easily have a gospel that begins with, Matthew chapter 25. Right? There's no reason we couldn't have something like that. That simply tells the story of the cross and then the resurrection. What we have instead, consistently with all four of them, this is amazing, okay, is we have stories of the passion, the death and the resurrection of Jesus, that are embedded in these other stories that also contain his teachings, teaching I live. Right? I don't know, is that what were you asking? Is this not going? All right, so Rachel, you're so perceptive because this is exactly what I'm trying to talk about. Okay? The things that we learn about Jesus is like when Jesus says, love your enemy. Jesus says, take care of vulnerable people. Or Jesus says, don't take vengeance. Or when Jesus says, honor your parents. Okay? All right? Or when Jesus says, let your yes be yes and tell the truth. Okay? Or don't let a person's life consist in the abundance of your possession. All these different things that we would isolate as Jesus' teachings, right? We can't understand them without the cross. All those things are part of the way of the cross. Right? That's what I'm really trying to hit on today. Okay? It's not all the other teachings of Jesus. Don't don't get Jesus' teaching of, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That's the greatest command on its own. You get that with the cross. Okay? You don't get love yourself on its own. You get that plus cross. You don't get judge not that you be not judged on its own. You don't get to carve that out and say, I'm going to just, you know what, I think Jesus is a great teacher. I'm just going to follow some of these ethical things that he has, should love each other and not judge each other. You don't get to have that. You can't take that without also taking the cross. All right? And Jesus says, let's read what he says, right? Let's put it in some context here. And Jesus is talking with his disciples, right? His disciples who have been following. Jesus, pushes them here. Verse 13 of Matthew 16. Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, and he asked his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? And they said, some John the Baptist, some say Elijah, and others say Jeremiah or one of the prophets. He said to them, who do you say that I am? And Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered him, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. Which is, again, reminds me of the stuff that Paul said earlier, Dave, right? In 1 Corinthians. It's kind of an interesting thing. For flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, Father in heaven. And I tell you that you're Peter, on this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I'll give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. He sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. From that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and have great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Jesus took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord. May this never happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You're setting your mind on divine things, not on human things. And Jesus told his disciples, if any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save my life will lose it. Save their life will lose it. Those who lose their life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life? They give in return for their life. Okay, all right, so let's just pull back with it, right? You cannot be my disciple without taking up your cross and following. That's a different kind of discipleship than anybody knew about. Right? Not just in, what did it mean to be a disciple? It meant to follow somebody's teachings. Okay? To follow somebody's teaching. And a lot of life goes into somebody. That's not to mean that they're just academic exercises, right? The rabbis had disciples who were supposed to become more holy people by following the things that the rabbis are teaching them. That's part of the whole exercise of being a disciple, being a student. And Jesus says, you can't be my disciple without taking up a cross and following me through that. Okay? Well, to me, that points to the fact that you can't really understand all the things that Jesus says, his teachings. That's what disciples do. They absorb teachings. Okay? You can't, whatever word we want to choose, Dave, grasp, absorb, understand, appreciate, really be shaped by the teachings of Jesus if all you have is the words of the teachings themselves. They have to be paired with the cross. I just find that to be really profound. Really, really profound. Okay? So when we struggle with one of the teachings of Jesus, one of the things that we have to do is we kind of say, we have to back up and say, how do I understand what Jesus has to say about being compassionate? How do I understand what Jesus says about loving my enemies? I would say you can't really understand that. Really understand it without the willingness to follow Jesus, not just in that teaching as an isolated thing, but you have to have a commitment to following Jesus in the cross, and then it opens it up. So the teaching of Jesus needs the life of Jesus to go with it. Okay?
Stephen, you read about, you're picking up bits and pieces as you go on your journey.
Yeah.
You get to that cross, you finally reached the maximum of what all these pieces represent.
That's right. And it ties them together.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's what I mean when I say they all are the way of the cross, right? So the way of the cross is Jesus praying in the Garden of Gethsemane to crying out, "It is finished," and breathing his last. Okay? But the way of the cross is also the Beatitudes. Okay? The way of the cross is also the greatest commandment. The way of the cross is the Good Samaritan and the prodigal son and the lost sheep. Okay? All of that is, as a whole, the Gospels are the way of the cross.
Is that what we were talking about on Sunday with the being in the world and not of the world? We have to walk that walk and be ready to accept the persecution that comes with walking the way of the cross.
Yeah, it's all that. Yeah, that's that thing about like the cruciform church stuff, okay? And that title, we say cruciform, we mean shaped like a cross. That's what the word cruciform means. Okay, that's the whole of that. It's kind of jargonish, but I kind of wish he had named that book something else. But all right, the church that's shaped by the cross is trying to process what it means to follow the teachings of Jesus based on what they see in the person and life of Jesus, most fully expressed in the cross.
Well, that even goes back to what just take Matthew chapter 1 and go all the way to me where you start about the birth of Christ. I mean, right
Because
there
Herod's,
is the first step toward the cross.
That's right. That's right. And Herod is a non-cross. He's the person wanting to wield the cross or the power of something, right? Yeah. But there's a suffering that's come. The Messiah that's coming endures suffering. You know, and I think that's just. I think it's very, very integral to the whole story. Okay? So we don't normally end classes with saying, "Hey guys, don't you remember how dangerous this whole thing that we just did is?" Okay. Forget everything that we just did. That was a terrible idea, right? That was near heresy. That was close to Gnosticism. It's not normally in classes, right? But I just want, it's important anytime we take time to distill what Jesus says. We've been very, very focused on doing that. You have to pair that ultimately with what Jesus does. And every time I walk away from a teaching of Jesus saying, hey, this just kind of sounds crazy. Jesus here says that if your eye is leading you into sin, you need to poke it out. Okay, well, that seems a little bit much. Okay? Well, how do I interpret that? Not just by the logic of the thing itself. How do I read it in the cross? Okay? How do I read that in the cross? And the cross shapes and frames what it means to be Jesus' disciple. Last thing I want to point to, you guys know this story, of course, but in Matthew chapter 27, when we get into the Passion story itself, I think Matthew's kind of been leading us to this. Well, let's see, what verse? Down in around verse 30 to 32. As they went out, they came upon. This is in the heart of the crucifixion story, right? As they went out, and then what's happened before is the mocking and beating from the soldiers, putting the robe on and striking him and all this stuff, right? They went out. Remember, the last line of 31 is they led him away to crucify him. As they went out, verse 32, they came upon a man from Cyrene named Simon, and they compelled this man to carry his cross. I think, that's meant to capture our eye as a place to put ourselves in that story. Okay? As an invitation, as a reminder to people who have been reading Matthew, who has already shared with us twice that we are to, as disciples, be people who carry crosses, right? Our own crosses. But here, he tells us this has a very quick aside. We don't know anything else about this guy. Has a very quick aside to show us somebody who is in a very literal, embodied way sharing in the work of carrying Jesus' cross. And I think that's meant to be an invitation.
Stephen, doesn't Christ's cross become ours?
That's exactly right. Yeah. Yeah. It becomes that's the invitation. That's the invitation. And vice versa, I would say too.
In this verse, one thing that jumped out at me, in verse 32, it says, they forced him to carry the cross.
Yeah.
I suspect that the apostles only understood what Jesus meant by their cross in the same way that we typically understand bearing our cross, until they were able to look at that after the resurrection. What I mean by that is that if you say, we've all got a cross to bear, we've got to bear a cross. Okay? Well, what we typically understand that to mean, how we apply that to ourselves, is enduring graciously those things that are inflicted upon us.
And we receive passively.
Right. And it's here that they forced him to carry the cross. Simon didn't have a choice.
Mm-hmm.
All right? I think that when the apostles look back on that, and Jesus called them to emulate him, as he calls us to emulate him, I think the message of the walk of the cross is that we, like him, will willingly accept persecution, adversity, pain, suffering, and even death when it is necessary for the benefit of others.
Yeah.
That's what we're called. Not bear alone.
Yeah.
And not be gracious when we're inflicted with pain. Because Christ did not have to go through that.
Yeah.
He did not have to endure that pain. He was willing to do it because we needed it.
Yeah, the cross is for the sake of others. Right? Jesus takes ours, we take his, okay? We take his by taking each other's, by taking our neighbors, right? Like that's the whole of it. This is an invitation to join in the work of cross carrying. And I think that I really think that's meant to shape. I think that's shaped the way that we understand everything else that Jesus had to teach us. Okay, all right. I think you guys have gotten where we've been trying to go today. I would just say that a similar sort of progression has in other stories of in the other Gospels as well. Like Luke does something I think similar. Mark does something in a way, and even Jesus, or even in John, this is like Jesus showing his disciples. He starts off by washing their feet, and he says, "Hey, by the way, if you're going to be my disciples," he says something actually similar to that first passage that we read in Matthew chapter 10, where he says, "Hey, no teacher is above his master," all that stuff. There's a section in John 13 that's almost exactly like it's one of the weird places that John says something that's similar to the others. And that's part of the towel story, which is also part of the story, right? I mean, there's a reason that washing of his disciples' feet is part of the passion narrative for John. As is Jesus telling his disciples, "Hey, you really should love each other a whole lot Nobody loves each other. Nobody loves somebody else more than if they lay down their life for their friends. Make sure you do that. Here he comes. All the Gospels have progressions like this, which are meant to say, make sure that as you're understanding the teachings of Jesus, hold them together with his life. Okay, hold them together with his life. What Jesus teaches us, he teaches us best and most fully and finally in the cross. Okay? All right, let's pray together. O Lord Jesus, our teacher, who has shown us your way. Jesus, help us to hear your words, to follow them with all that we are, even as we follow you on the way of the cross, a way of sacrifice for others, in love for them and in love for you. In the name of Jesus we pray. Okay. Next week, Genesis. That'll be fun. We're not going to do all of Genesis next week. I feel like that may be a little ridiculous.